I watched Wyatt Calloway walk a wild mare down over the better part of 3 days that spring. Patient past anything I understood as sensible, and it was somewhere in the middle of that particular slow education that I understood I was watching the same kind of danger that had widowed me 18 months before, and that I had invited it onto my own land anyway, with my own signature on the agreement.
Is it broken?
Because a farm without draft horses come spring planting was its own considerably surer kind of ruin. My husband Thomas had died breaking a green horse himself, thrown and then trampled in the confusion of a bad fall on ground. He knew better than almost any other patch of our own claim, and I had spent the 1.5 years since telling myself that grief eventually made a person sensible about danger, rather than simply numb to it. I still remembered with a clarity I wished some mornings I could simply misplace, the particular ordinary quality of that afternoon before it turned. Thomas whistling some tuneless thing while he saddled the gelding, telling me over his shoulder that he'd have the animal green-broke by supper and asking, half joking, whether I planned to have biscuits ready to celebrate. I had been shelling peas on the porch when I heard the commotion, and by the time I reached the corral, the worst of it was already finished. The horse standing off in the far corner trembling as badly as I was. Thomas himself gone still in a way no amount of my own screaming his name ever managed to undo. I still was not entirely certain, watching Wyatt work, which of those two conditions, sensible or simply numb, actually described me. What I knew for certain was arithmetic considerably more urgent than my own feelings about horses. Spring planting was 6 weeks out. I owned exactly one aging plow horse too stiff in the joints to pull a full day's furrow, and the going rate for a properly broke draft team from any dealer within 80 miles would have cost more than my entire winter's earnings from eggs and butter combined. Wyatt Calloway was, by every account in that stretch of Nevada territory, the best mustanger working the open range in a decade, a man who could read a wild herd's habits the way another man read a ledger. And he came to me that February with a proposition considerably more practical than romantic, though I understand now it planted the seed of both in the same conversation without either of us quite admitting it at the time. He rode up on a gray afternoon with sleet threatening, hat in hand the moment he dismounted, and introduced himself with a formality that struck me as almost old-fashioned, given how casually most men in that territory conducted their business. The Mustang herds that ranged the open country beyond my creek crossed my land regularly on their way to water, he told me, and if I'd allow him to build a funnel trap along that particular stretch and base his catching operation out of my barn for the season, he'd split whatever he caught evenly, breaking 2 head to plow-ready gentleness for my own use before he ever sold a single animal off the rest of the catch. I asked him why my land specifically, when plenty of other creeks in the territory ran through open range just as promising, and I watched him weigh his answer carefully before giving it. The particular deliberateness of a man who had learned the hard way that careless words could cost him considerably more than careless work ever did. He considered the question a long moment before answering, the particular careful honesty I would come to recognize as entirely characteristic of him. Word travels in this territory faster than a man's reputation can usually outrun it, he said. And there's fewer folks left willing to let a mustanger work their land without asking considerably more questions than you have. I expect that's worth something to me beyond just the water rights. I learned, over the weeks that followed, exactly what reputation he meant. Wyatt's own father had mustanged that same stretch of territory a generation before him, skilled enough at the trade to build a modest reputation, until a rancher 2 counties over accused him, on evidence considerably thinner than the accusation deserved, of running off branded stock along with the genuine wild catch and selling the lot together before anyone could properly sort one from the other. The charge had never been proven in any court, Wyatt told me, sitting by my own fire one cold evening with a candor that surprised me given how little he'd volunteered about himself before that night. But proof had mattered considerably less to that particular rancher's neighbors than the accusation itself. Wyatt had been 15 at the time, old enough to remember plainly the way former friends of his father's had stopped riding out to visit, the way the general store's owner had started counting his father's coin twice with a pointed slowness that no honest customer deserved, the particular death by 1,000 small withdrawals that a community inflicts on a man it has decided, without ever formally deciding anything, to no longer trust. His father had died 4 years later, Wyatt said. A broken and mistrusted man in a territory that had decided his guilt for him long before any actual evidence arrived to settle the matter either way, and Wyatt had buried him with the accusation still formally unresolved. A stain that had simply been allowed to fade with time rather than ever being properly lifted. I've kept a count ledger on every horse I've ever caught since the week I buried him, Wyatt told me. Tally marks and brand checks recorded the same day, witnessed by whatever neighbor happens to be nearby, because I decided young that I would rather be the most tediously documented mustanger in the territory than risk watching the same accusation catch up to me the way it caught him. The technique itself, watching him work that mare, was a considerably more patient business than I had imagined mustanging to be before that spring. Wyatt explained it to me over supper one evening. The particular art of relay walking a targeted animal, keeping just enough steady pressure on a single horse across days rather than hours, that the animal's own herd instinct eventually broke down into simple, bone-deep exhaustion, at which point a patient man could approach and halter it without the violence that gave the whole trade its rougher reputation. I watched him do it myself over those 3 days, riding a fresh horse each morning while the mare's own strength dwindled, never once closing the distance faster than the animal's own fear could tolerate. Content to simply be present at a steady, unthreatening remove until her exhaustion finally outweighed her wariness. By the 3rd afternoon, she had stopped running from him entirely, standing instead with her head low and her sides heaving. And I watched Wyatt approach her at last with a slowness that seemed, to my impatient eye, almost unbearable, murmuring some low, continuous stream of nonsense words the whole while until his hand finally rested flat against her neck without her flinching away from it. He used the funnel trap for the general herd. Wing fences built wide and narrowing gradually toward a corral, driving whole bands of mustangs through with considerably less individual cruelty than popular imagination assigned to the work, though he was careful to tell me honestly that some rougher operators in the territory still relied on creasing a running horse's neck with a rifle shot close enough to stun without killing, a technique that killed as many animals as it ever successfully caught, and one he refused on principle to practice himself. I found myself drawn to that particular patience despite every instinct grief had taught me to distrust in a man who made his living around wild horses, and I want to tell you honestly that some part of my growing fondness for Wyatt that spring was tangled up, in ways I did not examine closely enough at the time, with the specific fact that his patience looked nothing at all like the confident, hurried competence that had gotten Thomas killed. Thomas had believed the way plenty of young husbands believe about plenty of things, that skill and nerve were sufficient protection against a green horse's unpredictability, and I had buried him believing the same lesson myself, until I watched Wyatt spend 3 full days simply walking beside a frightened animal, rather than ever once forcing the issue, and understood, watching him, that there existed an entirely different relationship to that same danger than the one that had widowed me. I began finding excuses that first month, to bring coffee out to the corral fence more often than any reasonable schedule required, telling myself each time it was simple, neighborliness rather than the particular hunger to watch a man work with his hands in a way that made danger look considerably less like recklessness than I had ever once believed it could. Wyatt noticed, I think, though he was gracious enough never to remark on it directly, simply accepting the coffee and occasionally explaining, unprompted, some small detail of whatever horse he was working that day, as though he understood I needed the education considerably more than I needed the company, when in truth I suspect I needed both in roughly equal measure. It was in March, with the general herd already funneled and roughly 24 horses sorted into my corral, that Wyatt was thrown himself, not by carelessness, but by simple bad luck. A green gelding spooking sideways into a fence post at exactly the wrong moment and catching Wyatt's leg between horse and rail hard enough to crack the bone clean. I heard the specific sound of it from clear across the yard, a sound I recognized instantly and completely from a memory I had spent 18 months trying not to revisit, and I ran to him with a terror considerably larger than the actual severity of his injury turned out to warrant, though I did not know that yet. Kneeling in the corral dust beside a man making the same low-pained sounds Thomas had made in his own final hour. My hands, I remember, would not stop shaking long enough to be of any actual use. And I heard myself saying Thomas's name instead of Wyatt's at least once before I caught the mistake. A slip that frightened me considerably more than the accident itself had. I want to be honest that some part of me, kneeling there, was not entirely present in that particular moment at all. Caught instead in the older grief superimposing itself over the new fear, and it was Wyatt himself, pale with pain but lucid enough to notice, who reached for my hand and told me, plain, that a cracked shin bone was nothing at all like what had happened to Thomas, and that I did not need to bury him today on the strength of an old memory doing considerably more work than the present situation actually required. It took the better part of an hour to get him settled properly in my own house with the leg splinted and elevated, and I sat up with him well past midnight afterward. Not because his condition required the watching, but because I could not yet trust my own legs to carry me away from the sight of him breathing steadily in and out. I watched the funnel. Trap work in full for the first time on a cold morning in early March. 3 of Wyatt's hired hands positioned along the wing fences while Wyatt himself rode the herd in from a wide half-circle behind them, driving perhaps 40 mustangs at a steady trot rather than a panicked run toward the narrowing funnel of split-rail fencing that led, eventually, into my own corral. The particular skill of it, I came to understand watching him work that herd, was keeping the animals calm enough throughout the whole drive that they moved as a cohesive group rather than scattering wild in every direction. A pace that required considerable restraint from a man who could easily have pushed them faster and risked losing half the herd to panic in the process. He called out occasional low commands to his hands, adjusting the drive's angle by degrees rather than sudden correction. And I watched the herd flow into that narrowing funnel with something almost like willingness, exhausted enough by the steady pressure of the drive that the corral itself seemed, by the time they reached it, less like a trap than a simple continuation of wherever the herd had already been heading. Daniel Calloway arrived at my place the following week. No relation to Wyatt beyond the same coincidental surname that seemed to follow half the territory's most consequential men, serving as the district's livestock brand inspector, a position that required him to examine and certify any horses changing hands or leaving the territory for sale, verifying that no branded stock had been mixed in with legitimate wild catch, either by accident or by design. He arrived on a bay gelding of his own, sandy-haired and careful-spoken, carrying a leather satchel of papers and a small magnifying lens. I noticed him checking twice on the ride from his saddle to my corral fence. The particular fussy thoroughness of a man who took considerable pride in doing a tedious job properly rather than merely adequately. He was thorough in a way that made my stomach drop before he'd said a single specific word. Walking my corral fence line twice and examining each animal's hide with a careful, unhurried attention that reminded me, in its particular methodical way, of Wyatt's own patience with the wild mare, though the 2 men's purposes could not have differed more sharply in that moment. Word had clearly reached him ahead of his visit, some version of rumor traveling faster than fact the way it always seemed to in that territory, because he asked, almost apologetically, whether Wyatt's catch this season had drawn any particular notice from the Ashford outfit before he'd even finished his initial walkthrough. He told us plainly, once he'd finished his initial survey, that 3 of the 24 horses in that corral matched closely enough to warrant real concern. The description of stock reported strayed from the Ashford ranch 2 counties east the previous autumn, animals that had apparently wandered off during a bad early storm and never been recovered, presumed absorbed into whatever wild herd happened to be ranging nearby that season. I want to tell you plainly that I watched something old and frightened cross Wyatt's face hearing that news. The particular fear of a man watching his father's exact accusation arrive at his own door a generation later. And I understood, watching him, that whatever calm patience he brought to every wild horse he'd ever worked was about to be tested against something considerably less patient than any mustang. I've documented every animal in that corral the same day I caught it, Wyatt told Daniel. Steady, despite what I could see cost him to keep his voice that level. Witnessed brand checks, dated entries. The whole ledger available for your own inspection right now if you'd care to see it. Daniel studied him a long moment, And I watched him make the particular calculation of a man deciding whether to trust a ledger over a rumor that had clearly reached him before he ever arrived at my gate. "I'd care to see it," he said finally, "and I'll tell you plainly, I came out here half expecting to find exactly the kind of sloppy bookkeeping that usually accompanies this sort of accusation. I did not expect a ledger this thorough from a man with your particular family history in this territory. Wyatt's ledger showed 3 horses caught within a specific 8-day window in late February, each entry noting coat color, approximate age, and any existing brand marks observed at the moment of capture, witnessed and dated by a neighboring rancher who happened to be present each time. And Daniel spent the better part of an afternoon cross-referencing those entries against the Ashford Ranch's own reported losses, examining each of the 3 suspect horses' hides with a magnifying glass and a patience that surprised me given how briskly he'd conducted his initial survey. He worked in near silence for most of that afternoon, occasionally calling Wyatt over to confirm some specific detail from a particular ledger entry. And I watched the 2 men fall into an unexpected rhythm of careful cooperation, despite the considerable tension still hanging over the whole proceeding. Wyatt answering every question with the same patient thoroughness he brought to the horses themselves. Daniel cross-checking each answer against his own notes without once betraying which way his final judgment might land. It was examining the hair growth pattern across one gelding shoulder that settled the question most decisively, Daniel explained, showing us both the particular telltale swirl in the coat that marked old scar tissue from a healed brand. Hair that grew back in a distinct whirl, rather than lying flat the way undamaged hide always did. A scar pattern that matched, once he'd compared it carefully against the Ashford brand's known shape. Considerably better than simple coloring or build ever could have on its own. 2 of the 3 horses, it turned out, did carry that telltale scarring, faint enough that casual inspection missed it entirely, but unmistakable once a trained eye knew precisely where to look. The 3rd horse, despite matching the general description closely enough to raise Daniel's initial suspicion, showed no scarring at all, and Daniel concluded, after considerable careful examination, that resemblance alone without any actual scarring meant that particular animal was almost certainly wild-born after all, simply sharing common Mustang coloring with the 2 genuine strays rather than being stolen stock itself. Daniel rode out to the Ashford Ranch himself the following day to arrange the return of the 2 confirmed strays, and came back 3 days later with news that considerably eased the tension still hanging over my corral, and over whatever fragile thing Wyatt and I had been building in the middle of all this uncertainty. The Ashford foreman had confirmed the 2 horses on site the moment Daniel led them into the yard, recognizing specific white markings on each animal's face that had never made it into the original written description at all, and had thanked Daniel plainly for the careful, patient work of sorting genuine strays from wild-born mustangs, rather than simply confiscating the entire catch on the strength of rumor alone, which lesser inspectors in less careful territories had been known to do. Daniel told us the foreman had gone so far as to apologize, unprompted, for the imprecise original report that had nearly cost an innocent man his reputation a 2nd generation running, admitting that the description his own hands had given at the time had relied more on general impression than any careful recollection of actual markings. Man in my position could make his job considerably easier just seizing everything and letting a judge sort the mess out later, Daniel told us, back at my own kitchen table that evening, turning his hat slowly in his hands, the way I'd noticed he did whenever a conversation touched on something he took seriously. But I watched what an unproven accusation did to men in this territory before I ever took this post myself. And I decided early I'd rather do the tedious work of actually looking than hand out ruin on a rumor's say-so. The remaining 22 horses, cleared entirely of any question regarding their ownership, were mine and Wyatt's to split as originally agreed. And I want to tell you honestly that watching Wyatt break my own promised pair to plow-ready gentleness over the following weeks, patient and unhurried in exactly the fashion that had first drawn my attention that February, taught me something about danger and skill together that 18 months of grief alone had never quite managed to teach me. He worked with each animal in the cool of early morning before the day's heat set in, never rushing past what a given horse seemed ready for on a given day, and I took to bringing my coffee out earlier and earlier just to watch the particular unhurried ritual of it. The way he'd stand motionless for whole minutes at a stretch, simply letting an animal grow accustomed to his presence before ever touching it at all. Thomas's death had convinced me that a man's confidence around horses was itself the danger. When what I came to understand watching Wyatt work was that confidence untested by patience was the actual hazard, and that the particular slow, careful competence I had mistaken for excessive caution in those first weeks was in fact the exact opposite of whatever recklessness had actually killed my husband. Wyatt asked me, the evening he finally judged both plow horses properly gentled and ready for my own spring furrows, whether I intended to keep the arrangement to a single season's business, or whether I might consider something considerably less temporary. We were standing at the corral fence in the particular gold light of early evening, both plow horses grazing calm and unbothered a few yards off, and I noticed his hands were not quite steady on the rail, the first genuine nervousness I had seen from him since the day he first rode up asking permission to work my creek. I told him with a directness that surprised even myself that I had spent a year and a half after Thomas's death believing that loving anyone who worked around horses for a living was a grief I could not survive twice, and that watching him these past months had taught me the actual lesson had never been about horses at all, but about the particular difference between a man who rushed toward danger and a man who understood exactly how to earn an animal's trust before ever asking anything difficult of it. I told him I thought he'd earned rather more than a season's arrangement from me by that same patient measure, and I watched something in his face ease the same careful way I'd watched a wild mare's fear ease 3 days into his patient walking, as though he'd half expected, even after everything, that I might still choose the safer path of simply thanking him and letting the arrangement lapse come autumn. We planted that spring behind 2 horses Wyatt had gentled with his own hands, and I have thought often since about the particular arithmetic of that whole difficult season. A widow's fear, a mustanger's inherited caution, and a brand inspector's stubborn insistence on looking closely enough to tell a genuine wild herd from a rumor dressed up as certainty. The furrows came up straighter that year than any I'd managed alone with my aging plow horse the season before, and I remember standing at the edge of the field that first evening, watching Wyatt unhitch the team with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, and understanding that the particular quality I had once feared in a man who worked around horses had become, somewhere in the space of a single hard season, the exact thing I had come to trust most completely. The Ashford Ranch sent word the following autumn that they'd hired Daniel's own recommended methods for checking their strayed stock ever since, examining hide scarring rather than trusting memory and rumor. A small enough change in practice that nonetheless meant, Daniel told us proudly, not a single further false accusation had troubled a mustanger in that territory in all the years since. He rode out to visit us most autumns after that, never quite losing the fussy thoroughness that had first walked my fence line twice before saying a single word. And I came to think of those visits as their own small yearly proof that carefulness, properly applied, could mend considerably more than it ever damaged. Wyatt still mustangs that same stretch of range most springs, though he keeps a smaller operation now, choosing patience over volume the same way he always has, and some mornings, watching him work a new wild horse down toward trust across the better part of a week rather than an afternoon. I think of Thomas and of Wyatt's own father, and of how much of what nearly destroyed both men might have been saved by exactly the kind of careful looking that finally, properly, cleared an innocent man's name instead of simply assuming his guilt. I no longer flinch the way I once did that first February, at the particular sound of hooves against corral rails, though I will admit some part of me still watches a little closer than strictly necessary whenever Wyatt works a green horse. Old grief never fully retired, even once it has been properly outgrown. He tells me sometimes, catching me at it, that a widow's watchfulness and a mustanger's patience are not so very different qualities after all. Both of them simply love expressed as careful attention, and I have come to believe he is right about that more often than I once would have credited any man for understanding. Wild horse and a stolen one wear the same coat until somebody patient enough finally looks close enough to tell the difference. I have come to believe the same is true of most men the territory is too quick to judge.